Hi, I'm actor Ian Champion, and welcome to History of Horror Cinema, my podcast series devoted to the good, bad, and the ugly of horror movie history. Please don't forget to like what you hear and hit subscribe. I have such sights to show you. Frankenstein, 1931. Part 1. The Background. The journey to the eventual film script for Frankenstein was a labyrinthine one. In 1823, dramatist Richard Brinsley Peake wrote the first dramatized version of Mary Shelley's novel for the stage. Presumption, or The Fate of Frankenstein, introduced plot and character detail changes to her work that were still present right through to the Universal film. Another connection that ties The Fate of Frankenstein to Dracula in the 20th century comes courtesy of Hamilton Dean, the theatre producer whose stage adaptation of the Stoker novel had done so much to bring it to future cinema fame. After that success, he looked for another property which he could tour around England on a double bill with Dracula, and commissioned Peggy Webley to adapt Frankenstein. This became an equal horror hit, and the duplication of the earlier formula was completed when John L. Balderston applied the same revisionary treatment for Broadway of this material in 1930, as he'd already done for Dean's Dracula. Among his contributions to the developing mythology we know today were the introduction of a creation scene for the monster and the addition of Frankenstein's assistant, Fritz, who was mute. It was only for the 1931 film that the creators decided he should speak, so that Frankenstein had someone with whom he could share his plans. Producer Horace Liveright, who was behind the Broadway run of Dracula, wanted to add his own stamp to the script. But before that complication could add to the mix, the catastrophic stock market crash of 1929 cleaned him out. The Broadway run never happened, and he finally sold the Frankenstein movie rights to Balderston and Webling, who ultimately benefited in a deal made with Universal. The other similarity in the gestation of both horror films is the passionate commitment of Carl Laemmle Jr. in pushing it through production. His enthusiasm for Universal making Frankenstein was as keen as for Dracula. For a man who had been literally gifted his post of vice president of production by his father as a 21st birthday present, Laemmle Jr. showed great instincts in choosing commercial projects. Not only were these two highly successful, in fact vital money-makers for the studio, but he was also behind their seminal All Quiet on the Western Front. Universal bought the film rights to Frankenstein for $20,000, giving Webley and Balderston 1% of the gross profits for cinema releases based on their work. Having only existed till now as an official Frankenstein film in a rushed silent short by the Edison Company in 1910, which I covered in an earlier podcast episode, Life Without Soul, 1915, and Albertini's Italian version Il Monstro di Frankenstein in 1920, Mary Shelley's classic tale would now be galvanized into feature-length cinematic life in the sound era by an American studio who already had form in the genre. Robert Florey negotiated to write as well as direct the project in May 1931. Meanwhile, the studio had contracted Balderston to submit his own draft. Florey aimed to protect his position by insisting on a contract stating he was performing both duties on Frankenstein. This was granted by scenario editor Richard Schayer, but Florey was too appeased to spot that the document didn't specify the actual name of the film. Florey wrote his own screenplay's plot, enlisting Garrett Fort to supply dialogue. Florey invented the plot point of transplanting the criminal abnormal brain into the creature, later extended in Francis Edwards Farragut's draft to being a replacement by Fritz for dropping a normal one. This would mollify critics by safely explaining away the creature's homicidal actions. Under Florey's tenure as director, the role of Henry Frankenstein was originally earmarked for Bela Lugosi, following his success in Dracula. He tested for all of the character's scenes up to the birth of the creature. However, Laemmle Jr. ordered that he be transferred to trying out instead for the monster, a part which Lugosi saw as degrading. His makeup featured clay-like skin and an enormous head prosthetic, reminiscent of Paul Wegener as the Golem. Laemmle Jr. reported that seeing this footage made his father laugh like a hyena. According to stellar makeup artist Jack Pierce, who famously created the creature's iconic look, the fault lay with Lugosi, who heavily influenced the design. I quote, "Lugosi thought his ideas were better than everybody's." Allegedly, the actor quit the film, citing a desire to retain his self-professed romantic lead status. To be fair, an equal case was his dissatisfaction with the script's draft at this point, which, as we've seen, showed the creature as a rampaging, soulless machine. Certainly, the final shooting script pitied the monster much more than the stage play's source material. Ultimately, Lugosi was to play the scientist's creation. However, this would be down the diminishing quality line of sequels in 1943's Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. The poor reception for Lugosi's screen test resulted in Florey being sacked as director. To helm the project instead, Universal chose James Whale, a prestigious director they had under a 5-year contract. Mounting stage productions became a passion of his whilst he was a prisoner of war in a German camp during World War I. After the war, he abandoned his work as a newspaper cartoonist to concentrate on a career in the theatre, proving his own mettle with the classic material of R.C. Sherriff's play and film of Journey's End, and the movie of Waterloo Bridge. Whale welcomed the challenge of working in the realms of the macabre, the script being the strongest meat of the offers made to him, and never shied away from a subject that was daring, controversial, and new to him. This embrace of the unconventional echoed his private life, in which, rarely and riskily for the period, he was openly gay. To portray Henry, Whale followed his creative instinct and fought for Colin Clive, who'd played Stanhope to great acclaim in both Whale's stage and film productions of Journey's End. He respected Clive's talent and his distinctive clipped tones, a vocal versatility like a pipe organ. The studio ideally wanted Leslie Howard, at least agreeing that something in the scientist suited a very British cut-glass accented type that would continue through many incarnations. But Whale got his way. He had valuable experience in guiding Clive through the previous role's intensity, and suggested adding a measure of Stanhope's simmering breakdown into the part in a letter to the actor prior to filming. Whale was careful to steer Clive toward balancing Henry Frankenstein's excesses with a believable truth, finding different shadings to avoid running exclusively on a roaring, high-octane overdrive. He saw Henry as an intensely sane person, at times rather fanatical, and in 1 or 2 scenes a little hysterical. Even before filming, the director's considered approach and integrity is evident and pays off tremendously in modulating Clive's fierce energy and credibility, even at the highest pitches of emotion. One of my favorite moments in Frankenstein is his subtle and amusing reaction to Dr. Waldman's news that the creature has been given an abnormal brain. Henry ponders this coolly, his composure momentarily ruffled, glances at the doorway to the lab as if silently computing the odds of trouble, and then airily dismisses any hint of setback. Colin Clive, born Colin Glenn Clive Gregg in 1900, came from a distinguished military family. He was descended from Clive of India, the Commander-in-Chief of British India, Major General Robert Clive. Colin would later play Captain Johnston in the 1935 film about his illustrious ancestor, Clive of India. How ironic that he portrayed notable army roles as an actor, since he was training for a military career at Sandhurst when his horse fell, fracturing the young man's knee. This ended his following of the family business, as it were, so he switched careers into the theatre, studying at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. After stage repertory work, the huge critical and commercial success of Journey's End was to make his and Whale's careers, establishing him as a riveting talent, especially in tortured roles. He would go on to appear in 2 more horror roles in Mad Love and reprising the young scientist in Bride of Frankenstein. Privately, Clive's triumphs couldn't allay his insecurity and the crippling inner tension of attempting to hide his homosexuality, which was still illegal in those times. Unable to conduct his sexuality with the same boldness as Whale, his conflicted inner life channeled into the seething sincerity of his performances, but manifested itself more destructively in the chronic alcoholism which eventually claimed Clive's life so tragically early in 1937. From Billy to Boris. Boris Karloff was born William Henry Pratt in Forest Hill, Surrey in 1887 to a violent and abusive English father and an Indian mother who divorced Karloff's father within 18 months of Billy, her youngest child of 9, being born. Throughout his career, Karloff hid his ancestry, knowing that prevalent racism as well as racial typecasting would adversely affect his acting ambitions. Looking at early photos of him, courtesy of Stephen Jacobs' excellent biography, Boris Karloff, More Than a Monster, it's hard to believe he was able to keep his dark, brooding Anglo-Indian looks a secret. He would explain this away later as the product of spending too much time in the sun. After a somewhat uneven childhood, indulgence from his mother, and bullying by his siblings, Billy dodged a life in the civil service into which most of his siblings fell. His passion was for acting, overshadowing his studies whilst at Uppingham Public School, and kindled by seeing his brother George in the profession, who later abandoned it for the more secure world of paper merchanting. Billy's family tried in vain to use George's change of heart to persuade him into forgetting the notion of an unstable career in the theatre, holding an intervention during which they cruelly belittled his looks and talent. Partly to escape this lack of support at home, Billy took advantage of the period's welcoming of immigrants by Australia and Canada. The toss of a coin led him to plump for a Canadian adventure. He sailed to Montreal, listing his profession as farmer, with no knowledge of either the profession or his new home country. Although he had no firm plans, Billy could not be accused of being work-shy. He went from back-breaking farm work to real estate brokering before spotting an advert by chance in a newspaper. The Gene Russell Players stock theatre company were looking for a character actor. He bluffed his way in, and there began his grounding in arduous but solid technique as a repertory stage actor for various companies touring Canada. At one point, the turnover of productions he learned on the road was astounding. 2 plays a week for 53 weeks. It was around this time, circa 1911, that Billy Pratt became Boris Karloff, an important name transformation in horror history whose origin has never been definitively traced. Like many of Karloff's anecdotes, he wove fantastical stories that were often founded more in entertainment value than strict truth. Whilst it's true that Billy Pratt wouldn't have the same marquee impact, Karloff claimed that, I quote, "The Karloff comes from my mother's family. There were some Russian ancestors. And the Boris I took out of the air or something." The most plausible explanation, posited by Greg Nestoroff, suggests the inspiration was a Count Karloff in a Harold McGrath play that was staged in Canada 2 years before. Regardless, Boris Karloff was to conjure up a usefully enigmatic aura for his heavy features and presence. Universal would of course exploit this to the hilt when marketing his films, going so far as to refer to him simply by the surname for extra publicity chills. Thanks for listening, and if you like what you've just heard, don't forget to click so, and please hit subscribe. If you build it, they will come.